The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy begins with three lawyers learning one of their senior colleagues has died. Each makes the right outward noises, "Oh, what a shame he's died." But inside, each is considering their own mortality, and more immediately, how they might benefit, how the death of a colleague might lead to their promotion. You might be wondering why I'm holding a vial. On February 5, 2003, U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell was tasked by President George W. Bush with presenting to the world the evidence that the Iraqi president Saddam Hussein was developing and in possession of weapons of mass destruction. A web of lies is how Colin Powell characterized Iraq's denials that they had such weapons. George W. Bush's Secretary of State then held up a prop before the United Nations, a vial, with a teaspoon of powder in it. He told a little story, how in 2001 the United States Senate shut down because a comparable amount of anthrax was received in an envelope. People died.
The anthrax attacks have now reached the U.S. Capitol. The first outbreak in Washington, D.C. confirmed this morning in a Senate office complex just yards from the Capitol building where Congress sits.
Did Iraq or Saddam Hussein carry out this anthrax attack on the U.S. Senate? No, but they could have. And Saddam could attack neighboring countries or the U.S. with the anthrax he possessed. Powell said,
"Every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence. The gravity of this moment is matched by the gravity of the threat that Iraq's weapons of mass destruction pose to the world."
He added that Iraq's president Saddam Hussein had, quote, contempt for the truth. In hindsight, from where we stand, we know that the U.S. intelligence, the information underpinning Powell's presentation, was misleading. When Powell passed away in 2021, his obituaries all referenced this infamous presentation, one which damaged his reputation long-term, something he acknowledged, quote, "I regret it. I will always be seen as the one who made the case before the international community." When he gave the presentation, the world was waiting to see how the United States would deal with Saddam Hussein and Iraq. The infamous president of Iraq had missed one United Nations deadline to comply with weapons inspectors, and it was widely expected this meant the U.S. and allies would take military action to rid him of what they believed he had, WMDs, weapons of mass destruction. But British Prime Minister Tony Blair wanted to take one final step before an invasion. While he was fully behind President George W. Bush's posture towards Iraq, he needed parliamentary approval before committing United Kingdom forces, and backbench members of his Labour Party were, by nature of their left-wing roots, far from natural promulgators of war rhetoric. So Blair needed to convince enough of them to come along. To accomplish this, he offered UN resolutions that demanded Saddam prove he didn't have the weapons the world thought he did. If members of parliament could see the whole world was supportive, that a process had been followed, and that the war was an absolute last resort, more would vote in affirmative to use force. The US and UK had already spearheaded one UN resolution demanding Saddam allow weapons inspectors in to make sure he didn't have WMDs. His lack of compliance was seen as an admission he did indeed have them. After missing the deadline of that UN resolution, the Bush administration was ready to go. It was enough for them and the American Congress. It was time to invade Iraq. But according to President Bush's autobiography, during this period, Tony Blair wanted the United States to seek a second declaration from the United Nations. It wasn't clear his government could hold together. He needed the second declaration to legitimize his case to the British people that, quote, every avenue had been exhausted. He needed that second UN declaration to take British troops to war. President Bush wrote that during this time he called Tony by phone, quote, "I told him I'd rather have him drop out of coalition and keep his government than try to stay in and lose it." "I'm with you," Tony answered. "I pressed my point again." He replied, "I absolutely believe in this. I will take it up to the very last." Bush called Prime Minister Tony Blair my closest partner and best friend on the world stage. To many, the relationship between President Bush and Prime Minister Blair defined Blair's time in office. It is their bond that led to the invasion of Iraq, an invasion that at least resulted in 100,000 deaths, and likely hundreds of thousands. Hundreds of thousands. Here's the thing, Tony Blair and George W. Bush, bird's eye view, shouldn't have been such natural friends. Blair was the leader of the British Labour Party, historically a self-proclaimed socialist party. Blair read Trotsky in his university years. Bush, on the other hand, was a conservative Republican. He supported the death penalty, opposed stem cell research, opposed universal health care, made things like same-sex marriage into political weapons to hit moderate left opposition. Moderate left opposition that probably were more natural bedfellows for a moderate left politician like Tony Blair. So it was a weird match. In diplomatic circles, US and UK officials always tout this special relationship, the idea that the bond between them is closer than any other due to shared history, language, interests. So it was unlikely for Bush and Blair to have anything but a cordial relationship, pragmatic bonds based on shared values. But to be besties? You wouldn't expect it. But Tony Blair isn't such a predictable character. He took power for Labour through redefining what the Labour Party stood for, molding its left-wing nature towards a more centrist nurture. As he wrote in his autobiography, quote, "I had redefined the Labour Party as New Labour, a changed progressive force in British politics." Tony Blair entered office after John Major. Major had been leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party after Margaret Thatcher. The dominance of the Conservative Party in the 1980s and early 90s seemed unbreakable. In fact, they had governed for 18 years straight, defeating the Labour Party in 4 consecutive elections. During this period, the Labour Party seemed trapped at the 32-ish% of the vote mark. In 1997, Blair would lead them out of this wilderness and into power. Blair was born in 1953. His father was active in politics until he suffered a stroke, which ended his political career. Blair wrote, "My father became ill. He had a stroke. All our lives changed after that, really." After graduating from Oxford and passing the bar, Blair joined the Labour Party. From 1975 to 83, he was a rank-and-file member. But Blair says in his autobiography that a visit to Parliament inspired him to run for office. He felt it was his place. Blair's mentor was a moderate-left Labour voter. He says his mentor, quote, "never trifled with ultra-leftism, despite the false intellectual basis." Blair's wife was also a political moderate within Labour, quote, "She too had never had the slightest interest in intellectual or political posturing." Blair claims that even in his earliest years as a member of the Labour Party, even as he was espousing its traditional positions, he felt something was wrong. This wrongness seems to have mostly centered, again, on the intellectual leftists occupying its ranks, which he describes as people who talk about progressive change but don't affect it. Quote, "Battles aren't won by preachers." Tony entered political office in 1983 through his election to be the Member of Parliament for Sedgefield, a constituency in a former mining area. We get a taste of the future middle-of-the-road Tony Blair in his maiden speech to Parliament upon election, in which he distances himself from his party's socialist roots by throwing just a bit of ideological shade at bookwormy lefties. He says, quote, "I am a socialist not through reading a textbook that has got my intellectual fancy, nor through unthinking tradition." Okay, so what then is socialism to Tony Blair? He gives us a little bit of a word salad. Socialism, he says, stands for cooperation, not confrontation, for fellowship, not fear. It stands for equality, cooperation, fellowship, equality, aka just about any non-fascist politician could give this speech and just substitute socialism for their ideology. Mr. Speaker, conservatism stands for cooperation, fellowship, equality. Mr. Speaker, Calvinism stands for Mr. Speaker, environmentalism stands for Mr. Speaker, anarcho-syndicalism stands for equality. You get the point. Politicians speak in aspirational platitudes, no reservations there, but Tony Blair is going to build his career appealing to broad swaths just like this. Quickly, Blair became a notable young upstart in the party. Blair advocated a centrist direction for Labour, deviating from its socialist roots. He and others, like Gordon Brown, were part of a group of so-called Modernisers within the party, seeking to woo the electorate by espousing new views and new relations for their party. Let me give you my analysis. In my reading and research for this video, every time I saw concrete examples of what modernization meant, it meant moving to the center of politics, moving this left-wing party to the political right. Modernization was just a nice buzzword to say, be young and lurch to the right. Blair held office as a member of parliament for 14 years before being elected prime minister. Now, British prime ministers generally play musical chairs with high-ranking cabinet offices before even considering a run to be their party's leader. As the largest opposition party, as the Labour Party was during his entire pre-prime ministerial time, Blair was only to occupy so-called shadow cabinet roles. Just to be clear, the shadow cabinet doesn't lead to like a multiverse like Narnia or something. It's how the largest UK opposition party creates the veneer of a government in waiting. They fill shadow roles for all the real cabinet offices and sit across from the actual cabinet officials in Parliament. Blair joined this shadow cabinet in 1988 and began building his reputation. He was now seated on the front bench of the opposition. Joining him was another man first elected in 1983, Gordon Brown. Brown was another modernizer and started to climb the ranks of Labour. In 1988, Brown filled in as Shadow Chancellor and built a reputation as an up-and-comer, someone likely to take on more leading roles in the party, perhaps even party leader one day. Blair says he also saw Brown this way and even imagined himself as a useful number two to party leader or Prime Minister Gordon Brown. Conservative Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was finally ejected from power in 1990 by her own party after 11 years in power, replaced by a member of her own party, John Major. In 1992, Major called a general election and won yet another majority for the Conservative Party. In the wake of the 1992 defeat, John Smith was elected the new Labour leader. As part of his efforts to learn lessons, he sought Labour modernizers for leadership roles. He appointed Tony Blair to a prominent spot as Shadow Home Secretary, which Blair used to express tough on crime sentiment. And Smith appointed Gordon Brown as Shadow Chancellor. So it went for 2 years. But then John Smith died suddenly in 1994. According to expectations, Gordon Brown would stand and win election to be the next Labour leader, but Tony Blair had different ideas. Now, remember my melodramatic reference of the death of Ivan Ilyich at the beginning? A senior lawyer dies, and several other lawyers, upon learning of his death, immediately stop thinking about how sad death is and begin to plan their own futures. Here's an excerpt from Blair's autobiography describing the moment of Labour leader John Smith's death. I tried to compose myself. He had been a big part of my life, and I liked him very much. We had spent many times together, working and socializing. I know what was coming now. He was gone. Who will be the successor? Blair didn't even wait a paragraph to ask that question, though I guess we can at least credit him for mourning the, quote, many times they spent together. Blair goes to great lengths to appear like he was modest, but when describing how he usurps Gordon Brown, he comes off as quite the plotter. He describes discussions a couple years earlier. Quote, Gordon was unmarried, and I told him frankly that I thought that was a problem. I felt the position of leader had to be taken, not necessarily at the due moment, but seized, almost, if you will. Blair apparently told his wife, quote, if John dies, I will be leader, not Gordon. Well, when the moment came, Blair did seize. The morning after John Smith died, Blair told Brown they needed to talk. Brown punted until later in the day, seemingly knowing what the subject matter would be. Speaking to a colleague that wanted Blair to support Gordon Brown, Blair said, don't cross me over this. This is mine. I know it and I will take it. Weeks went by. A couple other Labour members of Parliament joined the race to be leader, but Blair and Gordon Brown met each other repeatedly, debating, haggling, haranguing. Media speculation was tabloid about how the two friends now were potential enemies. In the end, Blair had to cut a deal with Gordon Brown. If both men remained in the leadership race, they would split the vote with their similar centrist peels. They might both lose. Their Labour Party modernization dreams would die. Blair also offered a consolation prize for stepping aside. Blair promised Brown that not only would Brown become chancellor in his government, thereby controlling the budget, but he would be a powerful chancellor with, quote, free rein on economic policy. Further, if Brown stepped aside, he would be Blair's successor after 2 terms. But spoiler alert, Tony Blair led the Labour Party through 3 general elections. After countless meetings, Brown agreed to step aside for Blair. After an uneventful leadership race, Blair became leader of the Labour Party in July 1994, thus beginning nearly 3 years leading the opposition in the House of Commons. In his first year in opposition, Blair made good on his promise to move the Labour Party towards the center of British politics to prepare them for a general election. He first set about removing Clause 4 of the party platform, which called for nationalization of the economy, quote, the common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. Very socialist, very intellectual. Blair didn't like it. Yeah, as we've already seen several times, Blair had a particular distaste for the intellectual left. Clause 4, which he says was written by a great Fabian of the party's intellectual wing, had aged. Quote, what was mainstream leftist thinking in the early 20th century had become hopelessly unreal, even surreal. This socialist thinking was the first to go when Blair took over the Labour Party. Next along that theme, he committed to business. Quote, where was our business support? Where were our links into the self-employed? He cut links to trade unions whose leaders he'd already alienated. Quote, unfortunately, they were still powerful and sufficiently relevant within the Labour Party. He took away the party's commitment to nuclear disarmament, and he promised to be tougher on crime. Finally, he wanted more integration with Europe and common market, not less. The last one is hard to conceptualize today as we've come to associate Euroscepticism with the UK's political right, but there is plenty of Euroscepticism on the left too, and by advocating greater ties with Europe, Blair was eschewing that tradition. Britain's interests demand that this country is at the forefront of the development of the new Europe. When Blair first ran to be a Labour member of Parliament, he had to toe the Labour line on the European community. When he became leader of Labour Party and changed position to deeper links with Europe, opponents like John Major pounced.
He entered the House on an election address which demanded Britain's withdrawal from the community. Even though, Madam Speaker, he said later, I wasn't actually opposed to membership of the European community. I said within the closed doors of the Labour Party that I disagreed with the policy.
In total, on policy, we have a rightward drift. No, you're right. That way. Packaged together, Tony Blair called it New Labour. New Labour promised to occupy the center of the UK's political landscape and to give it a fresh, young face. The 40-something Blair with a full head of hair.
We are the mainstream voice in politics today, back on the side of the vast majority, to speak out for them and against.
In May 1997, Blair was finally able to put that assertion to the test in a general election against the Conservatives. Even before Blair became Labour leader in 1994, Labour had established a polling lead over John Major and the Conservatives, with vote shares ranging from low 40% of the vote for Labour to the mid-50s. On election day, Labour carried the lower end of that range, earning 44.4% of the vote in the United Kingdom. The Conservatives ended with about 31%, with the rest going to smaller parties such as the Liberal Democrats. While 10 points might not seem like a landslide, in a first-past-the-post system in which a district/constituency is won by the candidate with the most votes, regardless of if they win a majority, 10 points meant Labour ended election night 1997 with 419 seats, a majority of 179. The largest in the post-war period. It's clear Blair's appeal was wide, and energy for his leadership was high. Apparently, it even reached one of his conservative predecessors, Margaret Thatcher, who is reported to have remarked that if Blair were to win office, he, quote, won't let Britain down. Election results streamed in until the early hours of the morning. As the sun began to break, Blair's team had him say a few words to supporters.
A new dawn has broken, has it not?
On May 2nd, 1997, Blair began his tenure at number 10 Downing Street. He was the youngest to assume the office of Prime Minister since 1812 and would serve 10 years, longer than any other Labour Prime Minister in history. The achievement that Blair would like us to focus on, and with good reason, is the Belfast Good Friday Agreement in 1998, which brought an end to the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Though the peace process had begun long before Blair's time in office, his leadership was an important piece in the puzzle of success. On April 10, 1998, the Belfast Agreement was presented to the public. As it fell on Good Friday, it came to be known as the Good Friday Agreement. As per the agreement, the island of Ireland as a whole voted on it in a referendum. Decades of violence were resolving by peaceful means. Today, the agreement is often held as a sacred balance that must be honored, even as the UK navigates Brexit, for example. Often easier said than done. Blair rightfully dwells on it in his autobiography, calling the end result remarkable, moving, and satisfying. When he attended the first sitting of the devolved Northern Irish Parliament, he saw, quote, people who had wanted to kill each other were now wanting to work together. That day, for the first time, there was a protest, not about Northern Ireland, but about Iraq. When I saw it, I felt Northern Ireland had just rejoined the rest of the world. Which brings us back to the Iraq War, which is front and center when discussing Tony Blair. On September 11, 2001, Blair gave his assurances to George W. Bush that he would stand with the USA 100%. Blair promised Bush at his Texas presidential ranch that he would be with him on the Iraq issues, quote, "Come what may." Blair has often been asked if he regrets Iraq, and his answer is always no. Though he avoids the word no, he writes, quote, "I can't regret the decision to go to war. I can say that never did I guess the nightmare that unfolded." Blair reasserts the belief at the time that Saddam was developing WMDs and lists atrocities committed under his reign. To me, Blair is a man who calculates every word that comes out of his mouth, even in instances when he claims he doesn't. Why he did this to gain power is obvious. Why he does it even to this day out of power seems an exercise in protecting his legacy, and therein his conscience. But just to be clear, that's not impartial, that's my opinion. Let me give you more of it. By standing with President Bush, Blair attached his legacy to the war in Iraq. This is not only a legacy that has stuck in the short term, aka the years until now that Blair has been out of power, it's something that will stay with him long term. Look at Lyndon Baines Johnson, president after the Kennedy assassination in 1963 until 1969. LBJ was a man of Congress. He was elected to the House of Representatives, then the Senate, where he held a list of leadership roles. Once president, he used those experiences and relationships to preside over an FDR-style barrage of legislation coined the Great Society. The Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65, the creation of Medicare and Medicaid, poverty, arts, general social welfare, seatbelt laws. But what was Johnson's legacy? One that haunted him until his death. The initials LBJ conjures the ghost of the Vietnam War, a quagmire, a defeat, a cauldron of human suffering. Coincidentally, it was a war expanded on murky pretenses with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Johnson has been remembered for Vietnam more than anything else. And just as Johnson's legacy has been defined by a war started under murky pretenses, Blair's will be too. Colin Powell gave his presentation to the United Nations with the little vial, and upon his death, that hour of his life featured prominently in obituaries. President Bush will have his immediate leadership after 9/11 to help his legacy. Blair will not. His legacy will be Iraq. That's a pretty standard take, but I want to take that a little bit further because it's more than just the legacy of these men. It might sound callous, but there's more than even the lost lives of the wars themselves. I've been referencing this one graduate school professor a lot. I'm going to have to bring him on, but one of my graduate school courses was on the 1960s, taught by this professor whose books I've linked below. In one of his lectures, he spoke about a phenomenon during the Vietnam War. To show progress, to show the war was not the stalemate it was perceived to be by the public and the media, the US military would parade around tallies of killed enemy combatants. If more combatants were killed, if more Viet Cong were killed, progress must be made in the war against the Viet Cong, right? Trust us, trust the government. We have graphs representing fallen enemy soldiers, and the lines are accelerating up. But of course, progress was not being made in Vietnam. Eventually, the US government made a humiliating withdrawal. My professor argued that the effect was to discredit one of the most respected American institutions, and thus the American government itself. Hold that thought. Pause. The audio is going to shift here, and you're about to see future me. Oh, hello, it's me from the future, slightly unshaved and correcting course. I want you to hold that last point I made in your mind, that a misleading pretense for war and misleading progress in war not only made the military look bad, but eroded trust in government overall. Because while I was editing, I realized that no, citing and paraphrasing wasn't gonna cut it here. There is no better person to make this point than the man who made it first to me. So I emailed that mythical grad school professor and asked him to come on the show, because I believe there is a broader point to be made here to link back to Tony Blair and Western democracy more generally. So I asked for help, and Professor Steinhorn said yes. So this is Leonard Steinhorn, professor of communication, affiliate professor of history at American University, author of a couple books. One I see in the background, The Greater Generation, co-author of By the Color of My Skin, former speechwriter, someone who's influenced my thought and piqued my curiosity countless times. I emailed you and I said, hey, I'm working on this. I presented some of the writing and I had this paragraph on the Vietnam War. As the war progressed, there was an attempt by authorities to legitimize the effort of the war, to say that progress was being made. And that was done in a couple different ways. And I was hoping that you could just tell me, how did US officials and military officials try to convince the media and the general public that things were actually progressing in Vietnam, that they were going well?
Well, when you turned on the evening news, which about 70% or so of the nation was watching in those years, what you heard on a weekly basis was the body count. Now, the body count was sometimes parts of a body that were counted as a full body. But the point is that how many Vietnamese did we kill? How many North Vietnamese and Viet Cong did we and the South Vietnamese kill versus how many Americans died? And because it was so disproportionate that so few Americans, even though many Americans did die and many South Vietnamese did die, but compared to the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, it looked like we were winning that war. By conventional means, if you just counted the number of deaths, we could argue that there was, as General William Westmoreland, the lead general of our troops in Vietnam, said, there was light at the end of the tunnel. What began to emerge out of Vietnam was what was called the credibility gap, because journalists, and increasingly the American people, because journalists were beginning to report the fact that the military wasn't speaking the truth, that they were basically saying that the government was not telling us the truth, and there was a gap in credibility between what the government was trying to accomplish and what the people and the journalists were increasingly knowing about the war in Vietnam and whatever, quote, progress we were making.
This is what the war in Vietnam is all about.
That became even more clear when the Pentagon Papers were released. And it was the Pentagon Papers which basically said and showed and documented how the United States government and the Pentagon and the military and all the higher-ups throughout the Defense Department were not telling the American people the truth about this war, and in fact were lying about the war, or if you don't want to use such a strong word, knew better and were trying to put such a spin on the evidence that it ceased to have any connection with the reality on the ground in Vietnam.
This hurt the military's image. Before Vietnam, it was common to refer to the U.S. military as the service. In World War II, you bravely joined the service, the trusted American armed forces. After the follies of Vietnam, this term declined. You weren't in the service, you were drafted into the military. You volunteered for the Army or Navy. Professor Steinhorn argues that a lot of cynicism of institutions today, a lot of populism can be traced to this failure. A through line, perhaps not causal, but corollary from the rise of Nixonian grievance populism to the skepticism of government in our times. It goes back in part to those spreadsheets of dead Viet Cong that represented so much destruction.
If you look at surveys about trust in government, it peaked in the mid-1960s and began to go down. So you had Vietnam War, you had the Pentagon Papers, and then of course you had Watergate. So if we want to trace back from today, lack of faith in government, you've got to go back to its origins in the Vietnam War.
As with Vietnam, the Iraq War perpetuated a longer trend of distrust in U.S. government and Western governments that participated. The institutions of state lost credibility, and that opened the door for wider cynicism. If the government lies about war, what else do they lie about? If they can't provide coherent information before and during an operation of national importance, how can they plan an infrastructure project or start a new government program? The conclusion that many came to in the aftermath of Iraq is that our governments can't, and therein, perhaps, our democracies can't.
It really is a function of governments not being honest with the American with the people of their country. And when that happens, people lose faith in government, and they want somebody who appears to be straight talking and simple and honest and seemingly transparent, whether they really are or not. So you get a Boris Johnson or a Donald Trump who comes through, regardless of whether they are being honest or not, they give the appearance of being honest because they seem so undisciplined and almost unkempt that they seem to just say what's on their mind, whether what's on their mind is really being honest or just another form of disinformation or misinformation.
And that last point from Professor Steinhorn transitions us back perfectly to this video, because I'd like to offer an iterative thought. And just to be clear, I'm happy to be told my American-centric perspective is wrong in your comments below, or that I misunderstood the details from across the pond. But here's the thing, I see connections between the decline of trust stemming from Vietnam and Iraq in the United Kingdom's political context. My assertion is this: Tony Blair followed George W. Bush to the very end and unleashed similar declines in trust and rise in populist grievance that now agitates the UK's politics. Some arose inside the UK towards immigrants and the establishment, but also funneled outwardly towards the European Union. Then, when that exit project was hitting bumps in the road, it funneled to a renewed large majority for the Conservatives under the populism of Boris Johnson. Iraq came at a moment when the UK was already aware of its managed decline, a decline that seems to have continued in the years since the financial crash. Over Conservative governments since Tony Blair and Gordon Brown left office. What's the point of upholding your democracy? Why trust in your democracy when around you is decline and decay? The real risk here, in my opinion, is that democracies simply have a higher bar to work with. An authoritarian regime can make a mistake. Then, in general, they can apply their narrative on top of it. Silent dissent, and that society is forced to move right along. Nothing to see here. The bar is simply lower. But democratic projects don't have such leeway. In a constitutional republic like the US or a constitutional monarchy like the UK, Western democracies as we shorthand it, in these places, the people are entitled to know what their government is doing. Expect the press to point it out. Ideally, should point dissatisfaction towards voting behaviors so new leaders can fix problems. But that's the ideal. In practice, it seems democracies have less room for error before grievance leads to populism, before frustration with establishments lead to hostile distrust, perhaps before anger leads to anti-democratic behavior. Mistakes place the whole democratic project in question. So, no, actually, the legacy of Tony Blair is not just a war under false pretenses. It's not just Iraq. It's erosion. It's part of why we so often ask, why can't we trust our democratic leaders, even in contexts well away from foreign affairs? It's about how soft naivete from one can bring hard calluses from the rest. It's about how, as James Madison wrote, democracies have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. Tony Blair's legacy is a warning about what happens when leaders shake the tree of democracy.
It's not just faith in government that we have to talk about. It's a commitment to democracy. And if that commitment to democracy is lost, then, woe to future generations that don't have the gift that we've been given.
Speaking with Professor Steinhorn was indispensable when formulating my conclusion, so I've placed the full interview as a standalone video on Nebula. If you follow my link in the description, you support me directly and get Nebula with 40% off annual plans, like $30 a year, $250 a month. If you want to peek behind the scenes, follow the link in the description. Later, y'all.